Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion of organ acquisition and the cost report flow on the Medicare cost report. First of all, when we're looking at the organ acquisition cost report flow, we need to understand what worksheets are going to come into play, and we have a few of them. We have worksheet S-2, the control questions, worksheet A, which is your working trial balance, worksheet B and B-1, your indirect service costs or your overhead costs, general service costs, worksheet C for your total charges, worksheet D-4 is the actual organ acquisition settlement worksheet, and then we have worksheets E Part A and E Part B, which is where the organ acquisition pass-through cost will flow to. So first of all, let's take a look at worksheet S-2. Now we're going to see it in detail here, but what I wanted to mention is that we have two types of lines here. Line 125, first of all, is the overall line that basically asks if this facility is even a transplant center. If it is, then it expects at least one of these other lines, 126 through 131, to be filled out with a date. The first date is your effective date, your certification date. The second date would be a termination date if the program terminated during this cost report. So it's important to understand what dates those are, because only the organs that are acquired during those certification dates are going to be allowable for the cost report. Now those are, again, lines 125 through 134. The thing about that is that a non-certified transplant center should not be filling out a worksheet D-4 because you're not going to be able to be eligible for any Medicare reimbursement. The only way that a non-CTC can receive any sort of reimbursement is by selling the organs that they've excised to another certified transplant center or an organ procurement organization to recover their cost. And of course, that's the important thing to understand. This is not a profit type thing. It's a cost recovery. There are indeed costs related to excising the organs and transporting them and all of that. That's intended to be just a cost recovery. So the thing about this is that the dates, it's not just put any date in there. We do need to know the accurate dates for that. Now, worksheet A, we're going to see this in the next slide, but our what we call the direct organ acquisition cost centers, those are going to be found on lines 105 through 113, and we only report, again, direct is perhaps a misnomer, but the costs that directly relate to organ acquisition, we can clearly identify that they are just related to that acquisition activity. And the thing is, these are those costs that are billed directly to the hospital, or they might be purchased under arrangement. But the important thing to understand here is that on worksheet A, for anything on worksheet A, we're talking about all costs regardless of the recipient, Medicare or non-Medicare, regardless of the patient type. They're the costs for all organ acquisitions. That's the key thing. It could be all patients, but it's just those costs that clearly relate to organ acquisition, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So here we have the lines 105, and that actually should be 112. There's a subscript. 113 is completely separate. It's interest expense. But you'll have kidney acquisition, heart acquisition, all of those. The one important thing to understand is that if you do have these different programs, the costs must be split properly between those programs. It's not enough just to include the total cost in one of these lines. Each of them has their own review. Each of them has their own worksheet, and the information is important to be separate. So, again, I'm saying direct organ acquisition costs. We're going to talk about what that means in just a bit, but basically, the costs that will not be reported here, because they're going to be reported elsewhere, are the regular hospital routine and ancillary costs that any other patient might have for other things. The room and board, maybe some lab services, certain things just are not included in the direct organ acquisition. They're going to be included up above in the earlier sections of worksheet A. And we'll talk about how that gets allocated later on. So here are and again, direct it's not the best word, because indirect would be general service overhead costs, and we're not by any means saying that these other costs not reported in the direct organ acquisition cost center, we're not saying that those are overhead. They're other types of direct costs, but they're not directly related to organ acquisition. So I'm just using the word true here. Those that are reported in those lines that we just talked about. Fees or costs for organs acquired from another certified transplant center or OPO. That's the easiest cost to document. You should have an invoice for it. Any physician or surgeon's fees for excising the organ. Now, again, we need to stress here that we're talking about acquisition. It might be sold to another certified transplant center or OPO. That's fine. But any fee for your physician or surgeon for excising the organ needs to be included here. Transportation costs of the organs within the U.S. only. And, of course, with transportation comes preservation and perfusion, which is kind of cold storage, if you will. And medical supplies would come into play here. Any cost, now this one seems a little odd, but any cost associated with maintaining a pre-transplant patient on the waiting list. Now that seems odd. It doesn't really seem directly related to acquisition, but it does because there are various registration fees, and the big one would be the various types of testing and screening. In order to acquire an organ successfully and send it to the right location where that patient is, you need to know this information about the potential patient on the waiting list, who's next in line, who's likely to get it. Because if, let's say, someone in one part of the state seems like they're the right candidate, but then you test them and it's not compatible, then you now need to know you need to transfer it to a different location. And if you don't do it timely, of course, the organ might expire. So that's the key thing. That's the reason these costs are allowed. Now, as I said, the other organ acquisition costs, your regular routine and ancillary services from the hospital that are provided to the donors, and that's the key thing. We're talking, and we are talking, mainly living donors here, and obviously that only generally is for certain organs, but there are costs related to deceased donors as well, caring for the body, just the various services that need to apply there. So we have those types of costs, but those should remain in the appropriate lines on Worksheet A, not in the direct lines. Again, they'll be in their own routine or ancillary cost center. Non-allowable costs. These should not be allowed anywhere. They should be carved out. Any sort of travel, room, or board for either the live donor or the recipient, not allowed. Transportation of a potential deceased donor. So you're not really sure what organs are going to be viable necessarily, but you're transferring them to a transplant hospital. Now there's a time frame here though. Prior to 2/25/22, these were not allowed at all. After that date, they were allowed, or the costs are allowed, the transportation of the deceased donor in their entirety. Previously, again, only the organ itself was allowed. So up here, we said the travel room and board for any donors not, but the organ was. Now a deceased donor, that transportation cost is allowable. Rather than the alternative of excising all of the organs at the first hospital and transporting them separately, the thought is that they can do that at the next hospital. That's fine. And one thing that's not allowed, burial expenses for the deceased donor. Physician services, even though some of them are allowed, these cannot include transplant or post-transplant services. It's not that they're not allowable, period, but they're paid by Part B under the normal physician fee schedule, so they're not going to be showing up on the cost report as either pass-through or anything like that. Non-transplant education costs or travel expense, any post-transplant, and by the way, that term, a lot of times you'll hear pre and post. Pre is kind of the acquisition side of things. Post really is transplant and post. Those are not allowable because, again, those are paid under either the DRG for the hospital services or the fee schedule for the physician services. And follow-up visits after 6 months are not allowed. Anything up to 6 months is allowed. Part of our review involves reviewing the Worksheet A direct costs, and as part of that, we also have to gain an understanding of the provider's transplant program to see what types of costs you would have, where those would be reported, all of that. The other thing here is that the key thing, kind of a starting point, is we need to reconcile the amounts to the provider support, the working trial balance. So whatever amounts are on Worksheet A should tie out and reconcile to the working trial balance. We would also be looking for any A6 reclasses or A8 adjustments. And A6 reclasses are basically when costs are moved around from one place to another. Perhaps the way you've set up your working trial balance doesn't match the way things are required under Medicare, so things need to be moved. But A8 adjustments, these could be positive or negative. Basically, this means you have either removed a cost because it's not allowable, or maybe it's just allowable at a lower amount, or you've added a cost in. It wasn't on your working trial balance, but it is allowable, so you've added it in that way. Obviously, there needs to be documentation for both of these types of things, but one of the things we're going to be doing as a MAC, as auditors, would be reviewing both the reclasses and adjustments. So as a provider, you need to make sure that documentation is maintained. Now, pre versus post-transplant costs. Some of the items that we're looking for, and again, you would need documentation if we request it, would be the shifting of costs from post-transplant, which again is not allowable as a pass-through reimbursement. So shifting those costs from that post-transplant to pre-transplant or acquisition, because the risk there is that pre-transplant, that's going to generate a cost reimbursement item. Whereas post-transplant, it's supposed to be paid under the DRG for the most part, and it's not additional reimbursement on the cost report. So we would review for shifting, things that don't belong in pre-transplant, based on that list we talked about a bit ago. We would also need to determine how salary costs for your various employees are split between the pre- and post-transplant. Because, again, many employees are going to spend time in both areas of the transplant operation, both the acquisition side and the transplant side. So we need to know how their salary costs are split. Generally, there would be time studies, which is the bottom one down here. We would also, of course, need to know who these people are, what their job descriptions are, what staff is involved with the various types of transplant activities. Some of the issues we have noted, various MACs have noted during audits, are just simply non-allowable costs being included. They're not related to the organ acquisition, but somehow they made it to those direct organ acquisition cost centers. An unfortunately common one that we have to correct for quite a bit is when costs are reported in the wrong organ center. They were put in the liver versus the kidney, vice versa. And as we've been talking about, we need documentation for these things. So if there is no documentation for the cost, when the auditor is doing their review, unfortunately we're going to have to disallow that, and that could have a reimbursement effect. No effective documentation for the pre versus post transplant split. And again, we talked about the time studies. Those are required. There's kind of an unfortunately stringent standard that must be met for those time studies. And it's PRM 15.1, so the CMS publication 15-1, section 2313.2E. It goes through all the great details of those time studies, and there's going to be another YouTube video talking about that area specifically, but this one, again, we need the documentation. Same thing with administrative activities and salaries. They need to be split between pre and post. So again, we talked about how only the direct organ acquisition cost centers are included there. Now, Worksheet A8, we talked a little bit about that. Worksheet A8 and A6. The A8 is the adjustment. Now, this particular one, this is an example of an odd A8 adjustment. You'll notice there are a lot of miscellaneous operating revenue type items. Now, for most cost centers, that's perfectly fine. Revenues offset the expenses. They're normal revenue offsets. But when you see this kidney acquisition cost center, and there was a miscellaneous operating revenue offset, this is something that we would have dug into more deeply to see what really is this. Is this revenue for the sale of organs, for example? If so, it should be offset on D-4, which we'll see later, rather than here on worksheet A8. There might be some other adjustments. Late fees are not allowed, just like penalties are not allowed. So kidney acquisition, that was pulled out, $26. Here is a reclass, an example of a reclass. And now, in this case, you have to kind of look at the labels. The right-hand side is decreasing, which seems a little backwards. It seems like it would make more sense to decrease before you increase. But in any case, the decreases were to the acquisition, the direct acquisition cost centers. They were initially reported there. This is being decreased. And the post-transplant expenses, line 590, this is A8, line 592, line 11201 on worksheet A, those are being increased in the same total amount. So basically costs are being moved from the acquisition cost centers to the post-transplant expenses, which they've separately reported here. Now this is still, notice, 112, so that's still one of our what we kind of label as the direct organ acquisition cost center. Remember that went through all the 112s and the subscripts, but at least it's separated out now, and it can be, it won't go through to an actual organ pass-through reimbursement. Now later on we would actually expect that those post-transplant expenses, depending on what they were, if they're allowable as routine and ancillary, we would have actually expected those to be moved up to the routine and ancillary cost centers. If these are just not allowable and they're going to be adjusted later on, and they just went through a reclass first, then this might be all right, setting up a temporary cost center in order to get any related overhead assigned to it, allocated to it. There are a lot of things that could be going on here. So now we get to worksheet B and B-1. Again, any of those costs that are in those routine and ancillary cost centers or the direct organ acquisition cost centers, they need to be allocated general service costs, administrative and general, capital, any of those types of things. For the direct organ acquisition costs, and actually let me back up, for any of the costs that are ultimately determined to be organ acquisition related, those general service overhead costs are going to generate reimbursement. So as part of our review as an auditor, we would be looking at the worksheet B-1 statistics that are reported. We're going to be first of all looking at what statistical bases are you using, and then what documentation do you have for the actual statistic. So square footage, various other statistics, they need to include the proper pre- and post-acquisition split that you would have used for your cost centers themselves, the direct cost centers. And again, any statistic that relates to a post-acquisition cost center, in other words, a transplant center, should be included with line 30. That's just one example, adults and peds. They might be in many other cost centers of those routine and ancillary cost centers, though. The thing about the statistical bases is that they are required to be to be approved. If you make a change for those, you must have approval from the MAC, and there are time frames for that as well. You have to submit it 90 days prior to the fiscal year end, and then it has to be approved. So the statistics, again, they're going to be split using whatever allocation method you used before. Most of them are going to be time studies, but if we're talking about costs that are absolutely related to just acquisition costs, but they're just split between organs, CMS has in the past said for that type of thing, an organ-to-organ split, you can use an organ count percentage for those if you don't want to use a time study. But for a pre-post split, of course, this makes no sense. You have to use the time study. So worksheet B and B-1, just going through some of the issues we've noted as a MAC, as auditors in the past. In a lot of cases, costs were moved, they were reclassed, from one cost center to the next, but related statistics were not. And the unfortunate part of it right now is on the cost report, there's a nice A6 to move costs, but there's not a separate worksheet mechanism to reclass statistics. There's not like a B-1-6, for example. That just doesn't exist, and it'd get very complicated, honestly. So there's not something like that, so it has to be a manual reclass. And that's why it's commonly missed, and we have to go in and do that. Of course, improper allocations of statistics between the pre- and post-transplant services. And by the way, you'll notice, again, pre and post, those are just terms that are used to help show there's some sort of split. Sometimes you'll hear, I think you just heard me a few minutes ago, call it post-acquisition, which is actually probably a better term because, when you say post-transplant, well, hey, we're talking about the transplant, not just after the transplant. So just think of pre and post as acquisition versus transplant. That's a better way of thinking about it. Here's an example of B-1. These are all the types of statistics this particular provider is using and the quantities of those statistics. So now we get to worksheets C and the D series. With worksheet C, we're talking total charges for all types of services provided to all patients. Now, under the old 2552-96 form set, they weren't included at all. Worksheet C just stopped before you got to these lines. Under 2552-10, they are there, the new hospital form set, but there is not a cost to charge ratio calculated because it's not relevant. And when we get to D-4, we're going to see why that's not relevant. By the way, notice here, worksheet C is your total charges. D-3 and D Part 5 are your Medicare charges for just inpatient and outpatient services, respectively. So those are Medicare charges compared to your worksheet C, which is the total charge. Now, again, these direct, I should say quote-unquote direct organ acquisition cost centers are not included in the cost to charge ratio because that's not how they're apportioned into Medicare costs. The entire purpose for a cost to charge ratio is to say, for example, for this particular cost center, costs make up 25% of all their charges on the total basis. And then you use that cost to charge ratio and you go to your worksheets D-3 and D Part 5 for normal services, not organ acquisition related, and you multiply that cost to charge ratio by just the Medicare only charges to basically get at Medicare only cost. Again, that's just for non-organ acquisition or non-pass-through costs. Well, non-organ acquisition, let me stick with that. Organ acquisition apportionment is done differently. It's not done through this type of cost to charge ratio. It's done on D-4. Now, I'm not saying a cost to charge ratio does not come into play, but for a different purpose, and we'll see why in just a bit. So, the factor that is used to apportion Medicare organ acquisition costs is the Medicare organ count. It's called the Medicare ratio, or the organ ratio, and it's basically your Medicare organs divided by the total organs. We'll get to that in worksheet D-4. Now, as far as D-3 or D Part 5, again, these organ acquisition costs are not apportioned. They're certainly not going to show up. But the routine and ancillary costs, including those again, indirect, I hate using that word, but the ones that are not the directly related organ acquisition costs, they're just your routine and ancillary costs. Those are used to create the cost charge ratios, and we'll see why again on D-Part or D-4, those cost charge ratios are used for that purpose later on. Not to apportion down to the Medicare only, but actually to apportion between total routine and ancillary services and organ acquisition only related routine and ancillary services. Again, we'll see that later on. Here we have worksheet D-3 and D Part 5, And again, this is used even if you're not a transplant hospital. Actually, this is worksheet C, C part 1. Here's D-3. That cost to charge ratio that came from worksheet C for all these different cost centers is multiplied by the Medicare charges, the inpatient program, Medicare program charges, to identify the Medicare program cost. Here's a part of D Part 5. The same thing happens for these outpatient OPPS charges. Same cost to charge ratio multiplied by the Medicare only outpatient charges, OPPS charges, gives you the OPPS cost. But again, that's not the way that organ acquisition is allocated or apportioned into Medicare allowable. So to get us a little further in this discussion, let's talk about traditional cost reimbursement. I kind of touched upon it a little bit ago, but traditionally, for routine services, your daily room and board, essentially, part of the cost report, it's actually D-1. It takes total costs divided by total days, all patient types, to get a cost per day, cost per diem. And then that cost per diem is multiplied by just the Medicare days to identify the Medicare-only routine cost. For the ancillary side of things, the non-room and board, these are specific services that are charged for. We take total costs divided by total charges for each of those cost centers to get a cost-to-charge ratio. That cost-to-charge ratio is then multiplied by Medicare-only charges on D-3 or D Part 5 to get your Medicare-only ancillary cost. So here we're going to switch over to how the organ acquisition cost is apportioned. So we're going to split it between routine and ancillary. Now with routine, we're still calculating the cost per diem. It's the same cost per diem used on D-1 for all routine costs. We're using that. The difference is we're not multiplying it by Medicare-only days like we did before. We're multiplying it by organ acquisition-only days, whether they're Medicare or non-Medicare patients. That's the difference. What is the multiplier? What are we trying to narrow it down to? We're not trying to narrow it down to Medicare only yet. We're trying to narrow it down to organ acquisition only at this point. So that step gives us organ acquisition only routine cost, all payer types. That's D-4 Part 1. Then we multiply that by the Medicare organ ratio, and that's the final step to get down to Medicare allowed organ acquisition routine cost. D-4 Part 3 is where that's handled. We'll see that in just a bit. Then we have the ancillary side. Again, our first step is similar to what we've done for all ancillary costs. We develop the cost to charge ratio. But the difference here is that cost to charge ratio, again, is going to be multiplied by organ acquisition only ancillary charges. All payer types, Medicare, non-Medicare, doesn't matter. And that gives us organ acquisition ancillary only cost. Then we take that organ acquisition ancillary only cost and multiply it again by the Medicare organ ratio to get Medicare allowed organ ancillary cost on D-4 Part 3. So it's just a difference in what's multiplied by the apportionment factor, the cost per diem, the cost to charge ratio. So D-4 Part 1. This is where we're starting with the routine. We're doing what I just said before. This piece right up here, this is where this is happening. And again, we're multiplying the organ acquisition days by the per diems from D-1. We'll see that in just a bit. Lines 1 through 7, those charges, we're going to report the charges separately as well. Column 1, again, is charge information. There's no impact on reimbursement, but CMS wants that data to be reported. Routine services are not reimbursed based on charges. That's the key thing. Now, there is a rule. As far as routine, both days and charges, for a deceased donor, there's only a 1-day routine charge allowed generally. And the thought is that the organs should be able to be excised reasonably within 1 day. So anything more than that might be not necessary, unnecessary. Now, I know there might be some arguments against that, but that is currently the rule at this point. Column 2 would be the routine per diem amounts, again from D-1. And then column 3 is where we report the total organ acquisition days, regardless of whether they're Medicare or non-Medicare. The idea here, again, we said the deceased donor can only have 1 day of routine care, but the living donor, they might need to be in there for a while to recover, to stabilize, whatever. But it's the inpatient day of care rendered to the organ donor patient if they're hospitalized solely for the surgical removal of an organ that's going to be transplanted. The other thing about this is when we take a look at these days are important, and we want to make sure there's an admit and discharge date for that donor in the patient record. So that's one of the things we will be requesting of you if we are auditing this issue. And then column 4 is the product of those two, the multiplication of the per diem and the routine charges. Now this piece, this routine total acquisition cost, is going to flow to D-4 Part 3, line 56, column 1, and then again we're going to separate it into its Medicare component based on the Medicare organ count. So now we get to lines 8 through 41, still on D-4 Part 1. These are all of our organ acquisition charges. The idea here is we're still using that worksheet C cost to charge ratio, multiplying it by the organ acquisition ancillary charges, and to get the organ just the cost related to that. So column 1 would be the cost to charge ratio. Column 2 would be the charges themselves. Now the key thing here is this is a total amount. So we cannot pull this from the PSNR. The PSNR will just be a portion of it. This must come from your records, the provider records. Column 3 is, again, the product of that. Ratio is multiplied by the charges. So here we see that. I know we've been talking about it quite a bit. This is D-4 Part 1. All these routine cost centers. So you have the per diem, which was pulled over from D-1. You need to report the charges, the routine charges, just for informational purposes only. But the days, I know the label is not all that clear, but it's the days that really matters for reimbursement perspective. Organ acquisition days, column 3, 261 days in this example, multiplied by the per diem, gave us this amount of reimbursement. It is a little bit odd that they had ICU and CCU charges and no days. That would be something we'd be looking at. But in any case, that's how it flowed. Down on the bottom, 8 through the other lines, we have the cost charge ratio multiplied by the organ acquisition only charges. And then we'll get this is back to, there we go. I guess you can only see a little bit of it here. That was D-4 Part 1. We have the charges, and then the costs would be underneath this bubble. It's just hidden right now. Now, D-4 Part 2 is not a commonly used worksheet. That's if you have interns and residents that are not in an approved program. So if you need it, the mechanisms are basically the same, though. But D-4 Part 3 is the important piece. This is where everything gets summarized, and this is where the final reimbursement is determined. So column 1, we're going to see costs in just a little bit. Column 3 will be charges. Information only, again. But line 56, as I said earlier, this is where the routine and ancillary costs flow over from that D-4 Part 1. Lines 57 through 58. This is going to be D-4 Part 2 if you have it, which I said it's a rare worksheet. And then line 59. Remember all of those quote-unquote direct organ acquisition cost centers on lines 105 through 112. This is where they get summarized right here. And we're going to see that in just a little bit. Line 60, this is completely separate if the provider elects cost reimbursement for teaching physicians. 61 would be your total allowable costs and charges. We're still dealing with total costs, though. 62, this is where we start to get into the Medicare organ ratio, the very important piece of it. 62 is total usable organs. 63 would be Medicare usable organs. And 64 would be the Medicare organ ratio, the final organ ratio itself. So let's take a look at all of this, how it comes together. D-4 Part 3 is where we are focused right now. A lot of stuff happens in this little section. So Part 3, I said you're bringing in the routine ancillary costs. We're bringing them right in here from D-4 Part 1. We don't have line 57 and 58, pretty rare. That's at D-4 Part 2 if we needed it. Line 59, that would have been the direct organ acquisition cost from those Worksheet A direct organ lines. And again, we're mainly focused on cost. Yes, there's a charge column here, but it's informational only. So now, and then line 60 again, another pretty rare item, D-5 Part 2. But we ultimately get all of the organ acquisition costs. They're still both Medicare and non-Medicare, but they're all of the Medicare organ acquisition costs. So now we're moving on to the Medicare organ ratio itself. This is the key thing that drives the actual reimbursement. So we have the total usable organs of 276, the Medicare usable organs of, looks like 190 in this case, and then if you divide it, you get 68.84%. It's kind of odd. They should be reversed, you'd think, numerator over the denominator. But in any case, here's the calculation. This amount is now finally going to be used to allocate or apportion all those various costs we had up above down to Medicare only. In other words, this $17 million of total organ acquisition costs now equates to close to $12 million of Medicare only costs. Now notice the same thing is done over here in the charge section, but that's purely informational. This cost is what drives the reimbursement. And then notice we actually have two offsets now. This is an older screenshot. Line 66 is revenue for organs sold. And that, of course, if there's a revenue for that, it offsets the cost. There's actually another one, I believe it's 66.01 now, and it's a revenue from any sort of primary payer. If there's another payer other than Medicare that has paid something, that's going to offset what Medicare pays as well. And that ends up giving you the line 67 subtotal amount of reimbursement. This ultimately flows to E Part A line 55 for settlement. Now, by the way, I guess I should mention here, line 68 is fairly rare. These are organs furnished for Part B. This is a rare situation where perhaps the Part A benefits have expired or exhausted, I should say. So there might be a Part B organ. And if that's the case, then this amount, the calculation of this amount, this number of organs, will flow to E Part B instead. And it'll obviously reduce the amount that goes to worksheet E Part A, line 55. So now that's what we have there, important pieces. I'm going to get to this bottom statistic piece here in just a second, or just a bit. So again, the total usable organs, when we define that, these need to be all organs except that those were non-usable. And by the way, we will have a YouTube video specifically talking about these organ issues, how to count them, what is usable, what's not, how to handle research organs. There are things called en-bloc organs. There are a variety of things that we'll have a separate video on. Now, there's statistics. That last part down here are purely statistics to help explain and audit the costs. So that total usable organ should detail or should agree with the statistic on D-4 Part 4, line 84, minus any non-usable organs on line 83. Now, again, this does count organs that were only partially paid by Medicare. But if there's something that Medicare didn't pay even $1 of, it should not include the Medicare organ. It also should not include organs procured from a non-certified OPO. Those don't count. It should not include organs sent to a VA hospital sent outside of the U.S. or transplanted into non-Medicare beneficiaries. We're talking only Medicare organs, and all of these are excluded from Medicare organs. And it should also include, or it will include, those where Medicare fee schedule payment was made. That's that Part B organ that we talked about. They exhausted benefits, therefore Part B covered it for whatever reason. So we're going to be focusing, a lot of our desk review and audit protocol from CMS requires us to focus heavily on those organ count numbers. So as a result, we're going to be requesting documentation from you as the provider for how that number was determined and how it reconciles. I already talked about the line 68, the organs furnished to Part B. And again, here's a better explanation of it. The reason they're not entitled to Medicare Part A benefits or on the day of transplant because they've exhausted benefits. Therefore, it's going to be covered by Part B fee schedule. And we talked about line 69, the net organ acquisition costs and charges, and how that flows to E Part A line 55. Now, the last part we have here would be the statistics. These are all purely statistics, lines 70 through 74, detailing the inflow of organs. 75 totals that inflow. 76 through 82 details the outflow of organs. Line 83 specifically identifies those that are unusable. And 84 totals the outflow. The whole idea is that inflow must match the outflow. And that's basically what we're saying right here. Here are the statistics. So if there are any that are missing, this is going to lead to documentation. It's going to flag as a possible audit issue. So that's basically what we're getting at right here. And that takes us to the end of our discussion of the organ acquisition cost flow. Hopefully this has helped to clarify some issues for you. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video.